Art history is a science. Like any science, there is research done, hypotheses made, categorization and classification, books and articles written. There are beautiful ideas to discover, larger-than-life personalities, intrigue and scandal, all of which keeps it interesting. Events unfold through time simultaneously and globally, but when we study history, it appears deceptively linear and local. The development of art throughout history is no different. We can often only get a small picture of it at a time. Art is sometimes classified according to region and time periods. Often the art from these periods have similar characteristics, and it is easy to see the major concerns of the artists both formally and thematically. These periods of history, like the Tang Dynasty, the Renaissance, or the pre-Columbian period, often last for several centuries. But towards the end of the 19th century, a cultural shift happened in the West. Advances in industrial, scientific, and political ideas caused people to question the old ways. They wanted to build a new modern society. Artists also felt a need to invent new ways of expressing their experience of the world. These artists were said to be on the avant-garde. The ideas and techniques of these avant-garde artists changed art forever. But how did these ideas develop and spread? Artists don't exist in a vacuum. They read, study, go to museums and galleries, and meet each other and debate ideas. Sometimes writers and art critics notice tendencies and bring artists together. In this period known as modernism, the emphasis on original and new ideas caused artists to think more theoretically about their art. Art historians have grouped the artists who were linked through their similar ideas into what are called art movements. Although there were major and minor art movements, due to the rapid pace of this modern life, often these movements lasted a much shorter time than the previous periods. There are many of these movements. We are going to look at only a few so that we can see how art historians group these trends together. In the 1870s, a group of artists decided to ignore what the powerful Académie Française in Paris deemed acceptable art practice and explore the visual experience more directly. They were interested in color and light and how the eye processed information. To depict this phenomenon, they developed a style of loose brushwork, which created a soft focus. In a satirical review of Monet's painting, Impression Sunrise, critic Louis Leroy coined the term Impressionism to describe this type of work. Rejection of the ideas that came before you would become part and parcel of the modernist ethic. By the mid-1880s, artists began to question the Impressionist naturalistic use of color. They were interested in presenting their experience in a more expressive way, and shape and color began to take on a more symbolic role. British artist and critic Roger Fry organized an exhibition titled Manet and the Post-Impressionists, and coined the term. Building on this idea, a loosely affiliated group of artists began using bold color and flatter pictorial space. They exhibited together for the first time in the Salon des Arts in 1905, which also happened to have a sculpture of Renaissance artist Donatello in it. Critic Louis Vassel described the show as Donatello among the wild beasts, and the artisan exhibition became known as Les Fauves. While Fauvism as a movement was short-lived, one of the artists involved, Henri Matisse, would emerge as one of the 20th century's most innovative artists. Another of the 20th century's most groundbreaking artists was Pablo Picasso. In 1907, Picasso painted this painting. Influenced by Cézanne, with its flattened space, distorted form, and inclusion of African masks, Picasso had moved painting towards a theoretical investigation of form. Picasso was trying to paint these women as they were and not as they looked. Picasso shared a studio with Georges Braque, and together their approach to form was to analyze it, break it apart, and tried to represent all aspects of it simultaneously on the flat plane of the picture's surface. Braque's painting, Maison Lestat, caused the same French critic, Louis Vassel, to describe the painting as cubic oddities. That's two movements that the French critic's sarcasm inadvertently named. This approach to form has been dubbed analytical cubism by subsequent historians, and because of its abstract approach to form was one of the most influential art movements of the 20th century. Concurrently, in Northern Europe, a number of artists were rejecting the depiction of physical reality and were after the expression of a highly charged, pure emotional effect. Using distortion and disharmony, these artists approached color and form as a way to communicate deep feeling. Two groups of artists formed in pre-World War I Germany. One, in Dresden, was called Die Brücke, the bridge, and the other, in Munich, Der Blaue Reiter. These artists took the idea of art as a vehicle for authentic emotional experience to the extreme. They moved closer and closer to full abstraction, and one of their members, Vasily Kandinsky, is credited with making the first fully non-objective painting. Again, this expressionistic movement would have much influence on art in the 20th century. With World War I came the devastation of Europe. While many artists took part in the war, some fled to neutral Switzerland to avoid the war. A group of artists, writers, and poets met at the Café Voltaire in Zurich. They believed that the social, cultural, and political landscape had been polluted by bourgeois society, which had become apathetic and spiritually corrupt. They believed that art was complicit in this corruption and therefore needed to be destroyed. Led by Tristan Tzara, a Romanian artist, these artists engaged in a form of anti-art they called Dada. Marcel Janco recalled, "We had lost confidence in our culture. Everything had to be demolished. We would begin again after the tabula rasa. At the Cabaret Voltaire, we began by shocking common sense, public opinion, education, institutions, museums, good taste, in short, the whole prevailing order. Using chance, nonsense, and irrationality, they saw their anti-war activities as a way to fight against the social and political forces which had caused the war." Dada as a movement ultimately spread to Berlin, Cologne, Paris, New York, and even Tokyo. Techniques pioneered by the Dadaists like photomontage, assemblage, and the use of chance would also influence many artists who came after. It also had a critical role in changing art from a primarily visual experience to a conceptual one. As the war wound down and Europe began to rebuild, artists were looking for a way to help rebuild culture as well. They understood the Dadaist view that an obsession with rationality had led to the Great War, but rejected the nihilism in their approach. André Breton had studied psychiatry and worked in a neurological ward during World War I. He moved to Paris in 1921 and began to associate with artists there, including Tristan Tzara. Influenced by his work as a psychiatrist, he wrote the Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, which purported that in order to have a pure, authentic human experience, one must be free from the control of reason or aesthetic or moral concerns. This meant allowing the subconscious to be free and accept the results of irrationality as valid. Automatism, the release of this pure state in writing or drawing, and the use of dream imagery became cornerstones for those artists who wanted to take the nonconformist ideas of Dada in a more positive direction. In 1913, an exhibition of modern European art known as the Armory Show had come to New York. Many avant-garde artists were leaving Europe and coming to America as the events leading to World War II began to unfold. The Armory Show, along with the arrival of these European artists, many of whom became teachers, exposed American artists to the ideas of abstraction, surrealism, and rebellion. In the 1940s and 50s, a group of New York artists were championed by art critics Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg, and gallery owners Peggy Guggenheim, Pierre Matisse, and Julian Levy. Critic Robert Coates was the first to dub the style of these artists abstract expressionism. It would be the first truly American art movement and effectively move the focus of the art world from Paris to New York. After World War II, there was an economic boom in America. A workforce had returned from Europe, and factories would return to producing consumer goods like cars, televisions, and refrigerators, making life more comfortable and convenient. Television, newspapers, and magazines brought news of this prosperity, and of course the accompanying advertisements for it, into the American consciousness. First in Britain and then in the US, the lowbrow imagery of popular mass media began making its way into artists' work. Rejecting the style and seriousness of the abstract expressionists, artists brought humor and certain democratic ideal to art by using this popular imagery. Although British critic Lawrence Alloway made the connection between popular mass culture and art in 1958, the term pop art was first seen in America during a symposium on pop art at the Museum of Modern Art in 1962. Wanting to move back towards a more intellectual and theoretical approach to art, but still rejecting the emotional, spontaneous style of the abstract expressionists, two closely related movements, geometric abstraction, sometimes called hard edge painting, and minimalism emerged toward the end of the 60s and into the 70s. The artists in these movements were interested in the idea of reductionism inherent in modernism, and wanted to strip the visual experience of anything but the essential elements. Less is more became the mantra. Robert Morris's Notes on Sculpture, Parts 1 through 3, set up a conceptual framework for making art, which emphasized the gestalt of the viewer's experience with the object.
3 or 4 times, and a period when painting is dead is absolutely the best time to paint, because it's not the preferred sensibility, it's not dictated what painting should look like, nobody cares anyhow. Sculpture ruled. People were moving around tons of stuff and digging holes in the desert. It was dumb to paint, even dumber to paint figuratively. And the dumbest, most moribund possible convention to deal with was the portrait.
Minimalism had reduced the elements that were in the art object to the bare minimum. Often these objects were made with industrial processes and no artist touch. Some artists in the 70s and 80s wanted to get back to the handmade object, which brought the traditional skills of drawing and painting back into play. The inverse of minimalism and abstraction would become known as photorealism. We have only touched on a few of the art movements that took place in the modern period. There were many more movements, both major and minor in the level of impact they had on art. Many of these movements overlap, and artists who were and are interested in the ideas behind them continue to be influenced by them. There were, and still are, artists painting in the Impressionist style or making minimalist sculpture, long past the movement's initial explosion onto the art scene. In the 21st century, we still see some trends emerge in art making, but the concept of distinct influential art movements is losing its usefulness as a tool in art history. We may still group art into genres, like video, performance art, or installation, but with the eclectic nature of art making today, a fetish for the latest thing among many galleries and artists vying for attention, and the quick turnover of ideas brought about by technology, theoretical ideas of what art should be don't seem to coalesce the way they did in the 20th century. The term movement implies progress, and modern thinkers saw themselves as contributing to moving culture forward. But contemporary theorists have called the idea of linear cultural progress into question. Postmodern artists seem less concerned with defining art and accept pluralism and process as ends in themselves. Could the rejection of the idea of art movements be a movement? Only art history will tell.